Most people don't wake up in the morning thinking, today is the day I'm going to die. I sure didn't. My name is Kyrie and I'm 29 years old. Up until recently, I lived a peaceful life as a nun, tucked away in a small convent far from the world's noise. I never expected anything like what I'm about to share with you. I never thought I'd see death face to face and then come back. Yet here I am, alive and breathing, with a story that still leaves me awed and shaken. I've spent most of my life striving for a simple truth, to love God and serve others. I gave everything to follow that calling. But on a cold, rainy morning, in the blink of an eye, I crossed a line between life and death. A line I didn't even know existed until I tumbled right over it. What came after wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something so real, so vivid, that it changed everything I believed about this world and the next. And now I have to share it with you. Because what I saw affects not just me, it affects you too. Before all of this happened, my days were humble and predictable. I lived in a convent where we prayed at dawn, helped the poor, and spent long hours in quiet reflection. It might sound dull to some, but it was my life, and I found purpose in that routine. I never once felt the world was passing me by. I believe God placed me exactly where I was meant to be. Our days were simple. We woke before sunrise to pray, then spent time in the community's kitchen preparing meals for people who had nothing. Sometimes we visited hospitals, offering comfort to the sick and lonely. In the afternoons, we studied scripture or worked on tasks to keep the convent running, cleaning, gardening, or mending clothes. Evenings brought more prayer and reflection. It was a gentle cycle of serving, praying, and resting in the knowledge that we were doing God's work. I was content. I didn't crave money or recognition. Big promotions, vacations, and worldly success never crossed my mind. I wanted only to be near God, to be his hands and feet on earth. I thought my devotion would protect me from fear or doubt. I believed that if I stayed faithful, God would guard my health and keep me strong. But I was wrong, at least, about the part where I thought I was invincible. Because one morning, my body failed me, and I found myself on the doorstep of eternity. It started with a lingering fatigue that wouldn't go away. For days, my arms felt like they weighed a ton, and my legs grew shaky. I told myself I was just tired, maybe from too many hours of prayer or from fasting. I had pushed my body before. I assumed I'd bounce back like I always did. But that morning was different. Rain was tapping softly on my window, and I remember the damp chill in the air. My bed felt harder than usual, and when I moved to sit up, an odd numbness rippled through my fingers. I shook my hands a few times, trying to get the blood flowing, but the feeling didn't fully leave. Standing was a challenge. My head spun. My legs felt like jelly. Still, I convinced myself I just needed a drink of water. I reached for a glass on my bedside table. Suddenly, my vision blurred and the room started spinning. My chest tightened like an invisible hand was pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe. My heart fluttered in my chest, struggling to keep going. I felt the glass slip out of my hand. I heard it shatter on the floor. I tried to cry out for help, but everything around me went hazy. The last thing I remember was collapsing onto the cold stone tiles. I recall hearing faint footsteps racing toward my room, followed by someone calling my name in a panicked voice. Then nothing. Darkness swallowed me whole. When the darkness came, it wasn't just a blackout. It was a deep emptiness with no light, no sound, no texture, nothing. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But as my awareness returned, I realized I wasn't asleep at all. In that silence, I saw something that made my chest seize with alarm, my own body. I was above it, looking down. My face was pale, my hands limp, and my chest didn't move. I was dead. The strangest part was the calmness that settled over me. I didn't feel the anxiety I would have expected. Instead, I felt strangely detached, like I was an observer in someone else's tragedy. That's when I heard her, my friend and neighbor in the convent, whom I'll call Amara. "Oh Lord, please, someone help," she screamed. Her voice cracked with fear as she stood in the doorway, trembling. She fumbled for her phone, probably to call an ambulance. I wanted to tell her, I'm here, I'm right above you. But I had no mouth to speak, no body to gesture with. And before I could even process the terror or the sadness of that moment, something began to pull me away. It felt like I was caught in a gentle but irresistible current. There were no hands on me, no ropes, just an invisible force drawing me upward. I floated through the ceiling as if it weren't solid. My room, my lifeless body, Amara's frantic cries, all of it shrank beneath me until everything vanished into endless dark. I found myself in a place that was nothingness. A vast darkness extended in every direction, not at all like a regular night sky. This was heavier, more oppressive, like it was alive and could swallow you whole. At first, it was silent. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like distant moans carried by the wind. They grew louder, layering over each other in a chaotic chorus. Some voices groaned, some wept, others sounded furious. They were filled with regret, fear, and an unshakable despair. A terrible dread gripped me. Was this hell? Had I been judged and found unworthy? I knew I wasn't perfect. Even in the convent, I'd had my doubts and failures. Was this punishment? The more fear I felt, the louder and more desperate those whispers became. Suddenly, I sensed a presence in the darkness. I couldn't see it, but it was massive, so large and overpowering it was as if a mountain had come alive. I felt its focus settle on me, and terror unlike anything I'd known flared up inside me. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth. I tried to run, but I had no legs. I was powerless, engulfed by shadows and unseen horrors. Everything closed in, as though the darkness itself wanted to consume me. Then, a tiny pinprick of light appeared, no bigger than a distant star. I fixated on it with every bit of will I could muster. It began to grow, expanding like a rising sun in the middle of a desolate night. Its glow pushed back the darkness, silenced the whispers, and offered me a flicker of hope. The more the light grew, the more I felt chains, ones I hadn't even noticed, suddenly snap away from me. The menacing presence recoiled, as if it was afraid of that radiance. Warmth poured over me, more comforting than any blanket on a cold night. It felt like love, strong enough to chase away even the darkest fear. From the center of that brilliance, a figure emerged. At first, I only saw the outline of a man, but as he came closer, I recognized him, Jesus. Not just from paintings or Sunday school lessons, but in a way that resonated in my entire being. In his presence, I felt utterly humbled. My knees bent on their own, and though I had no physical body to speak of, my soul bowed before him. I perceived his power, but also his compassion. He looked at me as if he knew every heartbeat, every prayer, every doubt. He extended his hand toward me, and although no words crossed his lips at first, I felt his voice resonate inside me. You must see. In an instant, the light surrounding us shifted, and I found myself standing, somehow, inside a massive, modern city. Skyscrapers reached into the clouds, people moved about quickly, and technology was everywhere. At first, it seemed like a futuristic utopia, clean, orderly, and efficient. Screens on buildings displayed messages about unity and progress. People scanned their hands at kiosks to ride public transport, buy groceries, or enter buildings. Everything was integrated and smooth. Then I noticed a small mark on their right hands or on their foreheads. It was a symbol that appeared on posters, commercials, and signboards all over the city. The more I looked, the more I realized everyone had it. I turned around to ask someone what it meant, and suddenly, Jesus' voice stirred within me, filled with a quiet sadness. They will be told they have no choice. But I will provide. That's when I saw a different side of the city. Some people didn't have the mark. They looked worried, almost haunted. They tried to buy food, but were turned away. I watched a mother beg at a marketplace, clutching currency. But the vendor just shook his head and pointed to a scanner. No mark, no food. Tears rolled down her cheeks as her children tugged at her sleeves, hungry. I saw another man pleading in a hospital corridor. His wife needed medicine, but again, no mark meant no treatment. Security came and escorted him out. The hospitals and pharmacies refused to help. And so, the unmarked became outcasts, unable to work, travel, or even go to school. Fear was everywhere, but it wasn't always loud and aggressive. It was sometimes hidden, creeping into everyday life, convincing people they needed that mark just to survive. Families tore apart because of it. Friends turned on each other. The city's bright lights blinded people to the fact that they were giving up something priceless. The vision then zoomed in on those who had taken the mark. At first glance, they looked normal, going about their routines. But when I looked into their eyes, I noticed an emptiness. It was as if someone had dimmed the light in their souls. Over time, that emptiness grew. Their emotions became flat. They smiled, but it was a hollow smile with no spark of real joy. I saw a woman who had once been a loving mother. Now she passed by her own child, who was crying in an alley, without a flicker of recognition. Another man looked at his wife, who was mark-free, as though she were a stranger. The mark hadn't just turned them into obedient citizens, it had consumed something deeper, something we might call the human spirit or soul. Jesus' voice resonated again. It has already begun. I wanted to argue or ask him to stop it. Couldn't he intervene before things got this bad? But he only looked at me with eyes full of sadness and unwavering love. Warn them, he said. The time is short. My heart ached. But how can people live without this mark? I asked, even though I didn't speak words. He answered in that same gentle, powerful way. The world will say they have no choice, but I will provide. In that moment, I knew he wasn't just talking about physical provision. Food, shelter, medicine. He was talking about something far greater. Faith. Faith that if you remain true to him, he will carry you through anything, even when the entire world turns against you. Suddenly, the city vanished, and I found myself in a very different environment. It was barren, cold, and quiet. I saw small clusters of people gathered around makeshift fires in abandoned buildings or deep in the woods. They wore tattered clothes and looked exhausted, as though they had been on the run. These were the ones who refused the mark. They lived off whatever they could scrounge up. Some picked wild plants. Others gathered scraps from garbage bins behind deserted stores. Yet in their eyes, I saw something that had disappeared from the eyes of the marked, a spark of hope. I noticed a man kneeling on dry, cracked ground, praying fervently. His family stood behind him, their stomachs growling with hunger. Lord, you fed Elijah by the ravens and gave manna to the Israelites, he whispered, tears streaking his dirt-stained face. You're the same God now. Suddenly, green shoots erupted from the earth, blossoming into vines with fruit that looked fresh and nourishing. Their gasps of relief and gratitude echoed in that lonely place. Then, I saw another group huddled in a cave. A little girl lay burning with fever. They had no medicine, no hospital, nowhere to turn. A woman placed trembling hands on the girl's forehead and closed her eyes. Jesus, you healed the sick, made the blind see. If we can't rely on the world, we rely on you. Almost immediately, the girl's eyes fluttered open, her fever gone. Not all who avoided the mark were so steadfast. I saw a father wrestling with despair, his child weak from hunger. God will forgive me, he rationalized, eyeing a government outpost in the distance. If I take the mark just to buy some food, his wife gripped his arm, tears in her eyes. If we lose everything but keep our souls, we have lost nothing. If we gain the world but lose our souls, we lose everything. He turned away, torn between love for his child and love for God. Some would crack under pressure, others held firm. And I understood with blinding clarity the cost of that choice. Jesus' words echoed in my heart. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. My vision shifted again, and I found myself back in a sprawling cityscape, a version of the world where nearly everyone had eventually chosen the mark. Crime rates seemed non-existent. Everyone moved in a synchronized rhythm, and digital screens announced the end of hunger and poverty. It looked like a utopia on the surface, but as I walked through the crowds, I sensed something was deeply wrong. Emotions were missing. Love, compassion, creativity, the intangible qualities that make us human, had vanished. People were breathing and walking, but they were empty shells. In an alley, I spotted a child, skinny and dirty, huddled behind a trash bin. He reached out, Mom. Please, I'm so hungry, a woman passed by. She had the mark, and she didn't even blink at the sound of his voice. It was like she couldn't see him at all. The vision flashed to another scene, an outpost on the outskirts of a city. This was where the last unmarked families had retreated. Soldiers, their faces grim and focused, marched in formation. An official in a suit addressed the unmarked. "We don't want to harm you. We want to help. The world has changed, and you don't have to suffer anymore." He pointed to children with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. "Think of your kids. They can eat. They can have a future. All you have to do is accept the mark." A few, in desperation, stepped forward. One mother clutched a starving baby. She sobbed as she agreed. "I'm sorry, I just can't watch her suffer." But the instant the mark scanned her hand, something in her face changed. Her eyes dulled. She pulled away from her husband without a word, as if he no longer mattered. Others refused to budge. An emaciated man stood up, voice trembling but determined. "You cannot take what belongs to God," he said, standing between his family and the soldiers. "We have already made our choice." The suited official sighed. "So be it," he said softly, and the soldiers lifted their weapons. Right then, the air crackled with an unseen energy. The sky tore open with blinding light, much like the light I had seen in the darkness. It was of brilliance beyond words. The soldiers stumbled backward, shielding their eyes, but the unmarked stood tall. Their faces were bathed in that divine radiance. Burdens lifted off them like weights falling away. I felt my heart swell, tears filling my eyes. He had come. Jesus had arrived. The final confrontation was at hand. As I tried to comprehend this scene of glory, a powerful force yanked me backward. It felt like being caught in a raging river. Layers of light and dark rushed past me, and I tumbled headlong through space. I slammed back into my body with a sudden jolt. Pain stabbed every joint, and I let out a raspy gasp. My lungs burned, desperate for oxygen. I coughed, choking, my entire body trembling as it struggled to restart its functions. I opened my eyes to see Amara's tear-stained face hovering over me. "Kyrie, stay with me." "Oh, thank God," she cried, squeezing my hand so hard it hurt. The room swam around me, my vision fading in and out. I felt like I weighed 1,000 pounds. The effort of lifting my head was overwhelming. Yet I was alive, returned from that place of utter darkness and breathtaking light. It took hours for me to fully stabilize. Doctors rushed in, hooking me up to monitors. I heard words like cardiac arrest and extremely lucky, but my mind was only half listening. The other half was consumed by what I had just seen. I couldn't hold it inside. Even through my labored breathing, I tried to speak. I saw something real. My voice was barely audible. They probably thought I was delirious, but I knew the truth, and I would never forget it. In the days that followed, I wrestled with a deep sense of responsibility. I had died and come back. Why? It wasn't just a miracle for the sake of surviving. It was because I had been shown a future, a reality that was already unfolding. I wanted to shout it from the rooftops. We are going to face a choice that's bigger than we can imagine. I had seen how people would be convinced they had no alternative if they wanted to feed their children, get medical care, or simply keep their job. But the price of giving in was their very souls. Many folks dismiss these stories as hallucinations or chemical reactions in the brain. I know there are skeptics, but let me tell you, this wasn't a dream. It wasn't some fleeting near-death fantasy. It was more vivid than everyday life. That place of darkness, those desperate whispers, I felt them as tangibly as I feel the ground under my feet. That brilliant light and the presence of Jesus. There's no language that can fully convey how awe-inspiring and real that was. I could hardly sleep in the weeks after. Night after night, my mind replayed the scenes. The mother and her children being turned away from the marketplace, the father in the hospital begging for medicine, the families hiding in forests, the unstoppable emptiness in the eyes of those who took the mark. Then, at the end of every sequence, I saw the sky shatter like glass and Jesus descending in blazing glory, offering hope to those who held out, no matter how hard their lives had become.